Hello students, and welcome to this summary of Learning Unit 4, dealing with the international flow of news. This presentation will cover every section of the learning unit from the theoretical foundations of news flow through to South African media specifically. Because assignment 1 draws directly on this learning unit, particularly the theories of news flow and the factors that shape newsworthiness, those sections will get extra attention, and you will see that we will mark it with a little gold assignment 1 focus tag whenever they appear. So keep an eye out for those. And yes, let's dig in. The learning unit runs across 10 sections. We begin with an introduction to news as a form of information exchange. Then we move through the theories that explain the direction of news flow, the world systems theory, the dependency theory, and media framing theory, before we start looking at the concrete factors that make a story newsworthy internationally. From there, we cover the role of global and national news agencies, the actual content patterns of international news, the disruptive role of new media and social media, the often overlooked role of translation, and finally, two applied sections, Africa's position in global news flows and South African media specifically. Sections 4.2 and 4.3 carry the most weight for assignment 1, so we'll spend proportionally more time there. The study guide frames this whole unit around 5 crucial questions, and it's worth holding on to them as you go through the slides that follow. Are there real predictable patterns in how news flows around the world, or is it essentially random? Which types of events are guaranteed international coverage regardless of where they happen? What role do news agencies play as gatekeepers of that flow? What kinds of stories about Africa actually make it into the global news cycle? And how has the internet and social media changed all of this? By the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer each of these specific theory and with each of these questions with specific theory and examples, including from the SA-US tariff dispute you're working with in assignment 1. Learning Unit 4 opens by framing news itself as a commodity, something that is gathered, packaged, and traded, much like any other item of exchange, following Boyd Barrett and Rantanen. The framing matters because it shifts our attention away from asking, is this story true or important, and toward asking, why did this story get produced and circulated at all? Kim and Barnett give us the working definition we use throughout. International news flow is simply the pattern of news items exchanged between countries. And the reason this became a serious academic concern from the 1970s onward is that those patterns are wildly uneven. Uneven enough that developing nations pushed for a new international and communication order to try to rebalance who gets to tell whose story. So 4.2 is the theoretical backbone of assignment 1's question 1.2a and question 1.3a. So we're going to take it a little bit slowly. There are 3 theories on the table. The world systems theory and the closely related theory of structural imperialism explain the direction of news flow. They argue that structural inequality, historically produced by colonialism and capitalism, means news tend to flow from the center of the world system outward and rarely the other way. Dependency theory offers a related but distinct account, dividing the world into a developed center and an underdeveloped periphery, kept in that position by historical dependency relationships. Finally, media framing theory operates at a different level entirely. It's not about which countries get covered, but about how a story is told once it is covered. All 3 appear in assignment 1, so we will look through each of them in turn. These theories are important because they help us understand the structural and the ideological forces behind international news flow. And this is then, in terms of assignment 1, essential to analyze the SA-US tariff dispute. World systems theory, as Chang applies it in 1998, pictures the globe as a hierarchy of center, semi-periphery, and periphery nations. Center countries, think the US, the major European powers, dominate news production and consumption almost regardless of what's actually happening in them. South Africa is frequently classified as semi-peripheral, not fully marginal, not structurally central either, which means its access to global news attention depends heavily on its relationship with center countries. Peripheral countries have the weakest position of all. For them, the surest route into international news is conflict with or intervention by a center country. This is exactly the mechanism at work in the SA-US tariff dispute. South Africa's newsworthiness in this story is driven substantially by the fact that the United States, a center power, is the other power, or the other party. Structural imperialism is the companion concept. It names why this hierarchy exists. Colonialism and capitalism have produced durable inequalities in wealth, technology, and communication infrastructure that map directly onto who gets heard internationally. The case study from the study guide is the single clearest empirical illustration of world systems theory in action, and it's worth knowing the numbers. Chang analyzed Reuters' coverage of a 1996 WTO Congress, where procedurally, every one of 128 member countries got exactly the same 5 minutes to state its position, a genuinely level playing field on paper. But look at what Reuters actually reported. On the first day alone, the United States was mentioned 87% in nearly 87% of stories, while African countries, who delivered almost a quarter of that day's statements, appeared in only about 9%. Well under half of all member countries received any coverage at all. Takeaway Chang draws, and the one worth carrying into assignment 1, is that a country's international newsworthiness depends on its position in the world system far more than on the actual content or importance of what it says or does that day. Dependency theory is closely related to world systems theory, but worth distinguishing on its own terms. Marcus specifically noted students conflating the two in previous assignments. Dependency theory pictures the world as two concentric circles, a developed Western center and a periphery kept underdeveloped by historical dependency, that is colonization and continued exploitation by center-based institutions and corporations. It's a compelling account of persistent global inequality, but it has real critics. Japan and Taiwan are the standard counterexamples. Both were peripheral, colonized, or occupied territories that industrialized rapidly after World War II, which the theory doesn't easily explain. Critics also point out that withdrawing from relations with the center, which some African states did after independence, hasn't reliably accelerated growth, and that the theory can let internal factors like exploitation by local elites off the hook entirely. Media framing theory operates at a different level to world systems or dependency theory. It says about which country gets covered and more about how the coverage is constructed once it happens. The idea of framing traces back to Goffman in 1974, and Zhou's 2008 definition, the one the study guide relies on, describes a frame as an organizing principle that highlights some aspects of an event while leaving others out. 3 things to hold on to here. First, framing treats news as a social construction, not a neutral mirror of reality. Second, that construction is shaped by the reporter's own meaning, interest, and culture. Framing isn't accidental, it reflects a perspective. And third, frames function as news angles. They're the lens through which audiences end up attaching meaning to an event. This is a theory assignment 1 asks you to apply directly to the SA-US tariff dispute. Comparing, for instance, conflict frame against an economic or developmental frame. This case study is the closest thing the study guide gives you to a worked model for assignment 1. the framing question from assignment 1. So it's a good idea to pay attention here. Demisi's 2007 study compared how the Ethiopian news agency and Reuters covered the disputed 2005 Ethiopian elections. ENA, as the national government-linked agency, centered its coverage on the election process itself, framing it as democratic and constitutional and framing government leaders as visionary, while casting the opposition as unconstitutional. Reuters, as the Global Y agency, told an almost entirely different story about the same event. It centered the protests, the violence, and the mass arrests that followed, framing the process as manipulated and marked by a brutal government crackdown, and casting the opposition and the victims of violence as the legitimate party. Same election, two fundamentally different frames, shaped by each agency's institutional and regional position. This is precisely the kind of comparison assignment 1 asks you to construct yourself, using two real articles on the essay US Tariff Dispute. World system theory explains a general tendency, but it doesn't explain every case. Sometimes peripheral countries do occupy a prominent place in center media. So Chang introduces what he calls filters, additional factors beyond a country's structural position that shape whether a specific story gets covered. The study guide groups these into two families. Context-related or extra-media factors have nothing to do with the specific event itself. They're about the ongoing relationship between the reporting country and the reported country. Structural status, economic ties, politics and ideology, cultural and geographic proximity, and population size. Event-related factors, by contrast, are about the event itself. Above all, deviance, conflict, disaster, crisis. Assignment 1's question on newsworthiness asks you to identify factors and tie them to grassland and to Guo and Vago specifically. So the next two slides go through the context-related factors in detail, since that's where those two readings map most directly. Two context factors here, and both map directly onto assignment 1's question about newsworthiness. First, structural or hierarchic status, countries on the periphery or semi-periphery, which remember is where South Africa usually sits, don't carry much independent weight in international media. Their surest route into the headlines is a center country either noticing them or coming into conflict with them, which is exactly the dynamic behind why the SA-US tariff dispute is newsworthy at all. It's the US's involvement, more than South Africa's, driving global attention. Second, economic variables, which Rosengren found in 1974 outweigh most factors tied directly to the event itself. Media consistently favor stories about their trade partners and about countries with high GDP, and a country's economic strength also funds the very infrastructure, foreign correspondence, telecoms capacity that are needed to gather news and compete internationally in the first place. This is the Learning Unit 4 concept that lines up almost exactly with Guo and Vago's empirical finding that trade volume is the single strongest predictor of news flow in their data set. Rounding out the context factors, political and ideological conditions matter because media freedom and state censorship directly shape what flows in and out of a country. China's Great Firewall is the standard example of a government deliberately restricting the inbound flow of international news. Social and cultural proximity, that's shared language, religion, historical ties, eases the exchange of news. The study guide notes that Anglophone African countries trade more news with each other than with Francophone neighbors, purely on the basis of a shared lingua franca. Geographic proximity works similarly at a local level. South Africans tend to treat news from Zimbabwe or Namibia as quasi-local rather than properly foreign. The research by Kim and Barnett suggests distance matters much less once you're looking at the whole global system rather than a regional neighborhood. Finally, population attributes. Larger populations tend to both produce and import more news, and literacy levels shape a population's awareness of and appetite for international coverage. This slide exists purely to help you write Assignment 1, Question 1.2c, which specifically requires you to tie Learning Unit 4's factors to grassland and Guo and Vago, not to Learning Unit 4 alone. On economic variables, Grassland's models show GDP per capita and elite status, particularly permanent membership of the UN Security Council, strongly predict a country's news salience, while Guo and Vago find that bilateral trade volume is the single strongest predictor in their entire data set across every model they run. On structural and hierarchic status, Grassland's phrase is that provincialism still dominates global journalism. Coverage remains centered on large, wealthy elite nations, while Guo and Vago add an important refinement, distinguishing attention, who gets covered from influence, whose framing of a story actually spreads to other countries' media. And on geographic and cultural proximity, Grassland confirms distance and shared language remain measurable predictors, while Guo and Vago's more encouraging finding is that smaller countries retain more capacity to shape how their own domestic issues get framed internationally, even if they can't set the broader global agenda. Now we look at the role of news agencies. News agencies are the plumbing of international news flow, and Boyd Barrett's 1998 metaphor is the one to remember. Global agencies act as wholesalers, gathering news worldwide and selling it on to national and local retailers. There are three tiers. Global news agencies like AFP, Reuters, AP, they all remain even now, largely owned by US and British interests, and they effectively determine the international news agenda by deciding where to station correspondents, which stories to cover, and how much visual material to produce. Global television news agencies operate similarly for broadcast. In parts of Asia and Africa, the study guide notes somewhere between 80 and 100% of international television material originates from these agencies rather than from local production. And national news agencies sit underneath both, acting as vital intermediaries but remaining heavily dependent on the global agencies for anything happening outside their own borders. Section 4.5 asks what actually ends up in international news once you look past the theory of who's covered and toward the actual content patterns. Patterson's analysis, drawing on Mulwana and Van Ginneken, identifies a consistent set of patterns. The US and Western Europe get covered consistently by virtually every region in the world. After that, attention shifts to hotspot stories, political and other trouble spots. The Global South, when it does appear, tends to be stereotyped through disaster, conflict, corruption, creating an impression of constant chaos, while cultural, political, and economic progress in those countries goes largely unreported. Coverage tends to overgeneralize and lack depth. The study guide's memorable term for this is parachute journalism, correspondents who jump from crisis to crisis without the grounding to provide real context. And international news overall centers elite actors rather than ordinary populations. The cumulative effect, as the study guide puts it plainly, is that both the content and the flow of news serve to entrench the existing status quo, the same division into center and peripheral states that world systems theory describes. New media, the internet and social media in particular, is the disruptive force the section deals with. The study guide's headline example is the death of Osama bin Laden in 2011, where the news broke on Twitter well before any formal broadcast confirmation, a moment widely treated as a turning point for social media's role in international news. There's real optimism attached to this. Rampal argues the internet offers developing countries their best hope yet of more equal participation in global news flow, since it bypasses some of the traditional gatekeeping infrastructure. But the study guide is careful to temper that optimism with data. As of mid-2010, only about 10.8% of South Africans had internet access at all, according to Internet World Stats, which is a sharp reminder that cost and infrastructure still limit how far this leveling potential actually reaches. And one other further caution worth remembering, social media informs audiences that something has happened, but it doesn't replace the depth, verification, and context that formal journalism still needs to apply. 4.7 in the study unit deals with translation, and it's a short section in the study guide, but an important one because it's easy to assume that moving a story from one language to another is a purely mechanical, neutral process, because it isn't. Bilsa's 2007 research on news agencies shows that they rarely employ dedicated translators at all. Translation is generally folded into the ordinary work of editing. And editing and translation both involve selection, correction, and adaptation of the story before it goes out. That combination means translation is never simply word-for-word conversion. It's itself a point where a story's emphasis and even its framing can shift, often invisibly, to the audience receiving the translated version. Section 4.8 brings the theory down to the African continent specifically. Most of Africa sits on the periphery of the world system per McPhail's 2010 classification, with South Africa often treated as an exception, semi-peripheral rather than fully peripheral. The consequence, per Eribo's 1999 research, is a double distortion. Africa doesn't just receive a distorted view of the rest of the world through global news agencies, African audiences also receive a distorted view of themselves, since even African desks at the global wholesalers remain rooted in Western newsrooms and perspectives. Channel Africa, former SABC Radio Initiative broadcasting African news by Africans across 6 languages, is the study guide's case study in a genuine attempt to counterbalance that pattern. But it's not offered uncritically. Ndlovu's 2003 research asked a pointed question. Does South Africa's own expansion into continental broadcasting risk becoming its own form of media imperialism, just relocated to an African country doing the dominating this time? The lesson the study guide draws is that meaningfully counteracting global distortion of Africa likely needs a genuine multi-country effort, not reliance on a single dominant African broadcaster. Section 4.9 turns to South African media specifically. The policy foundation was laid through the Independent Broadcasting Act of 1993 and 2000, the Broadcasting Act of 1999, and the Telecommunications Act of 1996, all promoting free speech and liberalizing the broadcasting and telecommunications markets. That liberalization drove real growth, vibrant competition among new TV channels, online outlets, and increasingly mobile-first news audiences over the 20 years following 1994. Through Lloyd's 2013 research found that, although Lloyd's 2013 research found that somewhat paradoxically, South African media ownership has actually become amongst the most concentrated in the world in that same period. On the international news side, South African audiences can access CNN, the BBC, SABC News International, and eNCA News, all competing to cover global events for a local audience. And there's an ongoing tension worth knowing. The proposed secrecy bills of 2011 to 2013 illustrates the friction between legitimate national security concerns and press freedom when it comes to reporting on state officials and institutions. To close, here's the full learning unit collapsed into a single map against Assignment 1's questions, since that's ultimately why we've spent extra time on sections 4.2 and 4.3. For 1.2.a, you need the basic definition of international news flow plus world systems theory and structural imperialism. For 1.2b, the concept of structural or hierarchic status, illustrated by the WTO Congress case study, gives you the theoretical modeling for comparing wire agency and African coverage of the same event. For 1.2c, the context factors from 4.3.1, especially economic variables and structural status, are what you tie explicitly to grassland and to Woe and Vago. And for question 1.3, media framing theory from 4.2.4, illustrated by the Ethiopian election case study, is your direct model for comparing a conflict frame against an economic or developmental frame in your own real located sources. Everything else in this learning unit, news agencies, content patterns, news media, translation, Africa and South African media, builds the broader context that makes those specific applications make sense. That then covers Learning Unit 4 in full, from the basic definition of international news flow through to South African media specifically, with extra depth on the theories and factors that Assignment 1 asks you to apply directly. If anything here is unclear, particularly the sections tagged Assignment 1, please raise it in any discussions with the lecturing team, or also when we have our question and answer sessions for Assignment 1 preparation. Thank you very much, students, and we'll have more lessons soon.